Chapter 13 of Nothing of Importance by Bernard Adams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mines. 1. The Colonel wants to speak to O.C.B., sir. It was midday. It's about that wire, said Edwards, but we couldn't get any more without stakes. Oh, I don't expect it's about the wire, I said, as I hurried out of the straw palace. The CO knows we can't get the stakes. No, it was nothing to do with the wire. Just a minute, sir, said the telephone orderly. Hi, headquarters, is that you, George? O.C.B.'s here now. Just a minute, sir. A pause, followed by, Commanding officer, sir, and I was handed the receiver. Yes, sir, I said. This is Adams. Oh, that you, Adams? Well, look here. About this mine going up tonight. Got your map there? Well, the mining officer is here now, and he says, Look here, you'd better come down here now. Yes, come here now. Very good, sir, but the CO had rung off with a jerk, and only a singing remained in my ears. Got to go down and explain in person why the officer in charge of B Company wirers did not get out 20 coils last night, I said to Edwards as I hurried off down Old Kent Road. The CO's in an I gave a distinct order mood. Cheerio! On entering the headquarters dugout in Maple Redoubt, I found the CO engaged in conversation with an artillery officer. There had been another raid last night on the left, and our artillery had sent a lot of stuff over. This was the subject under discussion. I think you did damned well, said the CO as the officer left. Well, Adams, I thought it would be easiest if you came down. Here's our friend from the underworld, and he'll explain exactly what he's going to do. And I saw the R.E. officer for the first time. He had been standing in the gloom of the further end of the dugout. Look here, began the Colonel, as he laid out the trench map. Here is where we blow tonight at 6. And he made a pencil dot in the middle of the grass of no man's land, midway between the craters opposite the loop and the fort. And here, all round here. He drew his pencil round and round in a blacker and yet blacker circle. Is roughly where the edge of the crater will come. Isn't that right, Armstrong? Yes, was the reply. The crater edge won't come right up to the front trench, but I don't want anyone in the front trench, as it will probably be squeezed up in one or two places. Exactly, said the Colonel. Do you think this blow will completely connect up the two craters on either side? Oh, certainly, was the answer. There's no question of it. You see, we've put in... Here followed figures and explosives incomprehensible to the lay mind. It'll be the biggest mine we've ever blown in this sector. A surface mine, I suppose? I asked. Almost certainly, said the R.E. officer. You see, their gallery is only 10 feet above ours, and they might blow any minute. But they're still working. We wanted to get another 20 feet out before blowing, but it isn't safe. Anyway, we are bound to smash up all their galleries there completely, though I doubt if we touch their parapet at all. He spoke almost impatiently, as one who talks of things that have been his main interest for weeks, and tries to explain the whole thing in a few words. But, he added, I don't want any men in that trench. The mining officers always presumed that the infantry clung tenaciously, like limpets to their trench, and had to be very carefully removed in case a mine was going up. As a matter of fact, the infantry always made a rule of clearing the trench half as far again as the mining officer enjoined, and were always inclined to want to depart from the abhorred spot long before the time decided upon. That's clear enough, said the Colonel. Then from here to here we will clear the trench. Get your Lewis guns placed at these 2 points, ready to open fire as soon as the mine has gone up, and get your bombers ready to seize the crater edge as soon as it's dark enough. You'll want to have some tools and sandbags ready, and your wirers should have plenty of gooseberries and all the stakes we can get you. Right. As I went up 76th Street at 5:30, I realized that I had been rushing about too much, and had forgotten tea. So I sent Davies back and told him to bring up a mug of tea and something to eat. No sooner had he disappeared than I met a party of 6 R.E.'s, the 2 leading men carrying canaries in cages. They held them out in front, like you hold out a lantern on a muddy road, and they were covered from head to foot in white chalk dust. They were doing a sort of half run down the trench, known among the men as the R.E. step. It is always adopted by them if there is any strafing going on, or on such occasions as the present, when the charge has been laid, the match lit, and the mine shaft and galleries, canaries and all, evacuated. The canaries are used to detect gas fumes, not as pets. When I reached the fort, I found No. 7 platoon already filing out of the trench area that had been condemned as dangerous. "You're very early, Sergeant Hayman," I said. I looked at my watch. "Oh, all right," I added. "It's 20 to 6. Very well. Have you got all the bomb boxes and S.A.A. out?" "Yes, sir. Everything's clear." "Very well, then. All those men not detailed as tool and sandbag party can get in dugouts, ready to come back as soon as I give orders. There will probably be a bit of strafing." "Very good, sir." The Lewis gun team emerged from its dugout 20 yards behind the fort, in rather a snail-like fashion. I arranged where the N.C.O. and the 2 men should stand, just at the corner of the fort, but in the main trench. The rest of the team I sent back to its burrow. Edwards had made all arrangements for the other team. 10 to 6. It was a warm evening early in April, and there was a deathly calm. These hushes are hateful and unnatural, especially at "stand to" in the evening. In the afternoon an after-dinner slumber is right and proper, but as dusk creeps down it is well known that every one is alive and alert, and a certain visible expression is natural and welcome. This evening silence is like the pause between the lightning and the thunder. Worst of all is the stillness after the enemy has blown a mine at "stand to," for 10 to 1 he is going to blow another at "stand down." The sun set in a blaze of red, and in the south the evening star glowed in a deepening blue. What will have happened by the time the day has returned with its full light and sense of security? "Here you are, sir," I heard suddenly at my elbow, and found my mug of tea, 2 large pieces of bread and butter and cake, presented by Davies on a box lid salver. "I don't know if this is enough, sir. Lewis, he wanted me to bring along a pot of jam, sir, but I said Mr. Adams he won't have time for all that." "I should think not. Far too much as it is. Here, put the cake on the fire step, and take hold of this notebook, will you?" And so, with the mug in one hand, and a piece of bread and butter in the other, Scott found me as he came along at that moment, looking, as he told me afterwards, exactly like the Mad Hatter in Alice in Wonderland. "What's the time?" I inquired, munching hard. "I make it 2 minutes to 6," said Scott. "Go up a 6 o'clock," I said, taking a very big mouthful indeed. "Who put the sugar in this tea?" I asked Davies a minute later. "I did," said Davies. "Far too much. I shall never get you fellows to understand—" But the sentence was not finished. There was a faint "bomp" from goodness knows where, and a horrid shudder. The earth shook and staggered, and I set my legs apart to keep my balance. It felt as if the whole ground were going to be tilted up. The tea splashed all over the fire step as I hastily put it down. Then I looked up. There was nothing. What had happened? Was it a camouflet after all? Then over the sandbags appeared a great green meadow, slowly, taking its time, not hurrying, a smooth curved dome of grass, heaving up, 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 like a rising cake. Then, like a cake, it cracked. Cracked visibly with bursting brown seams. Still the dome rose, 10, 20 feet, up above the surrounding level. And then, with a roar, the black smoke hurtled into the air, followed by masses of pink flame creaming up into the sky, giving out a bonfire heat and lighting up the twilight with a lurid glare. Then we all ducked to avoid the shower of mud and dirt and chalk that pattered down like hail. "Magnificent," I said to Scott. "Wonderful," he answered. "The mud's all in your tea, sir," said Davies. Drrrrrrr rattled the Lewis guns. The Lewis gunners with me had been amazed rather than thrilled by the awful spectacle, but were now recovered from the shock, and emptying 2 or 3 drums into the twilight void. I was peering over into the vast chasm where 2 minutes ago had been a smooth meadow full of buttercups and toadstools. Suddenly I found Sergeant Hayman at my elbow. "The trench is all fallen in, sir. You can't get along at all." And so the night's work began. At 1 a.m. I was lying flat down on soft spongy grass atop a large crater lip quite 8 feet higher than the ground level. Beside me lay 2 bombers and a box of bombs. We were all peering out into a space that seemed enormous. Suddenly a German starlight rocketed up, and as it burst the great white bowl of the crater jumped into view. Then a few rifle shots sang across the gulf. There followed a deeper darkness than before. Behind me was a wiring party not quite finished; also the sound of earth being shovelled by tired men. A strong working party of A Company had been engaged for 4 hours clearing the trench that had been squeezed up. All available men of B Company, not on sentry, had been digging a zigzag sap from the trench to the post on the crater lip where I lay. 2 other pairs of bombers lay out on the crater edge to right and left. Behind me the wirers had run out a thin line of stakes and barbed wire behind the new crater. This wire passed over the sap, which would not be held by day. One wirer had had a bullet through the leg, but we had suffered no other casualties. Another hour and I should be off duty. Altogether a good show. 2. I was reading Blackwoods in a dug out in Maple Redoubt. It was just after 4, and I was lying on my bed. Suddenly the candle flickered and went out. I had to get up to ring the bell, and when I did get up, the bell did not ring, so I went out and called Lewis. The bell, by the way, was an arrangement of string from our dug out to the servants' next door. "Bring me a candle," I said, as Lewis appeared, evidently flushed and bleary eyed from sleep. "I don't know where you keep them. I can't find one anywhere." Lewis fished under the bed and discovered a paper packet of candles and lit one. "By the by," I added, "tell the pioneer servant" this was Private Davies, my orderly "to fix up that bell, will you? And I think we'll be ready for tea as soon as you can get it. What do you say, Teddy? Hullo, Clark, what are you doing here? Come in and have tea." "Thanks, I will," said Clark, who had just come down Park Lane. "I was coming to invite myself, as a matter of fact." "Good man," we said. Clark was no longer of B Company, having passed from Lewis gun officer to the Brigade Machine Gun Corps, so we did not see very much of him. At that moment Sergeant Major Brown arrived and stood at the door. He saluted. "Come in, Sergeant Major." "The tea's up, sir." "Oh, all right," I said. "I'll go. Don't wait if tea comes in, Edwards. But I shan't be a minute." As I went along with that tower of strength, the company sergeant major, followed by an orderly carrying 2 rum jars produced from under my bed, I discussed the subject of working parties for the night, and other such dull details of routine. Also we discussed leave. His dug out was at the corner of Old Kent Road and Park Lane, and there I found the "quarter" Company Sergeant Major Roberts, waiting with the 5 dixies of hot tea, just brought up on the ration trolley from the Citadel. Sergeant Roberts saluted, and informed me that all was correct. Then the sergeant major spilled the contents of the 2 jars into the 5 dixies, and as he did so the 10 orderlies, 2 from each platoon, and 2 Lewis gunners, made off with the dixies. Then I made off, but followed by Sergeant Roberts with several papers to sign, and 5 pay books in which entries had to be made for men going on leave. One signed the pay book, and also a paper to the quartermaster authorising him to pay 125 francs (the usual sum) to the undermentioned men, out of the company balance which was deposited with him on leaving billets. I signed everything Sergeant Roberts put before me, almost without question. "Well, Clark," I said, as we sat down to a tea of hot buttered toast, jam and cake, "how goes it?" "I've just been down a mine shaft with that R.E. officer. I forget his name. The fellow with the glasses." "I know," I replied. "I don't know his name either. But it doesn't matter. Did you go right down, and along the galleries? How frightfully interesting. I always mean to go, but somehow don't. Well, what about it?" "By Jove," said Clark, "it's wonderful. It's all as white as snow, dazzling white. I never realized that before, although you see these R.E.'s coming out all covered with white chalk dust. First of all, you go down 3 or 4 ladders. It's awfully tricky work at the sort of halts on the way down, because there's a little platform, and very often the ladder goes down a different side of the shaft after one of these halts. And if you don't notice, you lower your foot to go on down the same side as you were going before, and there's nothing there. The first time I did this and looked down and saw a dim light miles below, it quite gave me a turn. It's a terrible long way down, and of course you go alone. The R.E. officer went first, and got ahead of me." "Have some more tea, and go on." "Well, down there it's fearfully interesting. I didn't go far up the gallery where they're working, because you can't easily pass along. But the R.E. officer took me along a gallery that is not being worked, and there, all alone, at the end of it, was a man sitting. He was simply sitting, listening. Then I listened through his stethoscope thing." "I know," I interposed. "It's an instrument like a doctor's stethoscope, but by it you can hear underground sounds 100 yards away as clearly as if they were 5 yards off." "And I could hear the Boche working as plainly as anything. Good heavens, it sounded about a yard off. Yet they told me it was 40 yards. By Jove, it was weird. Pick, pick, pick. I thought it must be our fellows really, but theirs made a different sound, and not a bit the same. But you know, that fellow sitting there alone, as we went away and left him, he looked round at us with staring eyes just like a hunted animal. To sit there for hours on end listening. Of course, while you hear them working, it's all right, they won't blow. But if you don't hear them, my God, I wouldn't like to be an R.E. It's an awful game." "By Jove," said Edwards, "how fearfully interesting. Is it cold down there?" "Fairly. I really didn't notice." "I must go down," I said. "We always laugh at these R.E.'s for looking like navvies, for going about without gas helmets or rifles. But really, they are wonderful men. It's awful being liable to be buried alive any moment. Somehow death in the open is far less terrible. Ugh! Do you remember that R.E., Teddy, we saw running down the Old Kent Road? It was that night the Boche blew the mine in the quarry. Jove, Clark, that was a sight. I was just going up from Trafalgar Square when I heard a running, and there was a fellow, great big brawny fellow, naked to the waist, and grey all over, and someone had given him his equipment and rifle in a hurry, and he'd got his equipment over his bare skin. The men were fearfully amused. 'R.E.,' they said, and smiled. But, by God, there was a death look in that man's eyes. He'd been down when the Boche blew their mine, and as near as possible buried alive. No, it's a rotten game." As I spoke the ground shuddered, and the tea things shook. "There is a mine!" we all exclaimed together. "I wonder if it's ours or theirs," said Edwards. "I saw Hills this afternoon," I answered, "and he said nothing about a mine. I'm sure he would have, if we had been going to send one up. No, I bet that's a Bosch mine. Good thing you're out of it, Clark. Oh, don't go. Well, cheero, if you must. Look us up oftener. Good luck." Clark departed, and I resumed Blackwoods. "I say, Edwards," said I, after a while, "this stuff of Ian Hay's is awfully good. This about the signallers is top hole. You can simply smell it." "After you with it," was the reply. "There you are," I said at last. "It's called 'Carry On.' There have been several others in the same series. You know the 'First 100,000'? "No." "Good stuff," said I. "Good readable stuff, the sort you'd give to your people at home. But it leaves out bits." "Such as?" "Oh, well, the utter fed upness, and the dullness, and I don't know. You read it and see." That was a bad night. The Bosch Mine had caught our R.E.'s this time. All the night through they were rescuing fellows from our mine gallery. 7 or 8 were killed, most of them gassed. 2 of A Company were badly gassed too while aiding in the rescue work. This mine gas is, I suppose, very like that encountered in coal mines, and the explosion of big charges of cordite must create cracks and fissures underground that release these gases in all directions. I do not profess to write as an expert on this. At any rate, they were all night working to get the fellows out. One man when rescued disobeyed the doctor's strict injunctions to lie still for half an hour before moving away from where he was put, just outside the mine shaft. And this cost him his life. He hurried down the Old Kent Road and dropped dead with heart failure at the bottom of it. Hills told me he felt the pulses of 2 men who had been gassed and were waiting the prescribed half hour, and they were going like a watch ticking. Yes, it was a bad night. I got snatches of sleep, but always there was the sound of stretchers being carried past our dug out to the doctor's dressing station. Several times I went out to investigate how things were going. But there was nothing I could do. It was my duty to sleep. We were going up in the line to-morrow. But sleep does not always come to order. Before dawn we stood to, and it was quite light as I inspected the last rifle of No. 6 platoon. They were just bringing the last of the gassed miners down to the dressing station. I stood at the corner of Park Lane and watched. The stretcher bearers came and looked at 2 forms lying on stretchers close by me. Then they asked if I thought it would be all right to take those stretchers and leave the dead men there another hour. I said if they wanted the stretchers, yes. So they lifted the bodies off, and went away with the stretchers. There were several men standing about, silent, as usual, in the presence of death. I looked at those 2 R.E.'s as they lay quite uncovered. Grim their faces were, grim and severe. I told a man to get something and cover them up, until the stretcher bearers came and removed them. And as I strode away in silence between my men, I felt that my face was grim too. I thought of Clark's description, a few hours back, of the man sitting alone in the white chalk gallery listening, listening, listening. And now... Once more I thought of blind death. The Germans who had set light to the fuse at tea time were doubtless sleeping the sleep of men who have worked well and earned their rest. And here... They knew nothing of it, would never know whom they had slain. And I remembered the night Scott and I had watched our big mine go up. Wonderful, we had said, magnificent. And in the morning the R.E. officer had told us that we had smashed all their galleries up, and that they would not trouble us there for a fortnight at least. A certain man drew a bow at a venture, I said again, vaguely remembering something, but stiffening myself suddenly, and stifling my imagination. I met Edwards by the dug out as he returned from inspecting the Lewis guns. "Remember," I said, "I told you the first 100,000 leaves out bits. Did you see those R.E.'s who were gassed?" Edwards nodded. "Well," I added, "that's a thing it leaves out." End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of Nothing of Importance, by Bernard Adams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Billets. 1. Morning. 2 hours pack drill and pay for a new handle, I said. Right turn, said the sergeant major. Right wheel, quick, march. Get your equipment on and join your platoon at once. This last sentence was spoken in a quick undertone, as the prisoner stepped out of the door into the road. I was filling up the column headed "Punishment Awarded" on a buff coloured army form, to which I appended my signature. The case just dealt with was a very dull and commonplace one, a man having "lost" his entrenching tool handle. Most of these "losses" occurred in trenches, and were dealt with the first morning in billets at company orderly room. This man had been engaged on special fatigue work the last few days. Hence the reason why the loss had not been checked before, and came up on this last morning in billets. "No more prisoners?" I asked the company sergeant major. "No more prisoners, sir," he answered. I then, rather hurriedly, signed several returns made out by Sergeant Roberts, the company quartermaster sergeant, and promised to come in later and sign the acquittance rolls. These are the pay lists, made out in triplicate, which are signed by each man as he draws his pay. The original goes to the paymaster in England, one carbon copy to the adjutant, and one is retained by the company commander. We had paid out the first day in billets. This time, working parties had been tolerable. We had arrived back in billets about 3:30 in the afternoon. The next morning had been spent in a march to the divisional baths at Treux, 2 miles away, in cleaning up, kit inspection, and a little arm drill and musketry practice. In the afternoon we paid out. Then followed 3 days of working parties, up on the support line at Crawley Ridge. And now we had this last day in which to do a little company work. There had been running parade at 7:30. Owen had taken this, and I confess that I had not yet breakfasted. So I hurried off now at 9:10 to gulp something down and be at battalion orderly room at 9:30 sharp. The company office was a house of 2 rooms. One was the office itself, with a blanket-clad table and a couple of chairs in the middle, and all around were strewn strange boxes, and bundles of papers and equipment. On the walls were pictures from illustrated English papers, one of Nurse Cavell, another of howitzers firing, and several graphic bayonet charges at Verdun, pictured by an artist who must have glowed as he drew them in his room in Chelsea. In the other room slept the C.S.M. and the C.Q.M.S., more familiarly as the sergeant major and the quartermaster. From this house, then, I stepped out into the glaring street. It was the end of May, and the day promised to be really quite hot. I have already explained how completely shut off from the trenches one felt in Morlancourt, sheltered, as it was, in a cup of the hills and immune from shelling. Now, as I walked quickly along the street, past our battalion orderly room, and returned the immaculate salute of Sergeant Major Shandon, the regimental sergeant major, who was already marshalling the prisoners ready for the colonel at 9:30, I felt a lightness and freshness of body that almost made me think I was free of the war at last. My Sam Browne belt, my best tunic with its polished buttons, and most of all, I suppose, the effect of a good sleep and a cold bath, all contributed to this feeling, as well as the scent from the laburnum and lilac that looked over the garden wall opposite the billet that was our "mess." I found Edwards just going off to inspect B Company Lewis gunners, whom he was taking on the range the first part of the morning. "Hullo," he said, "you've not got much time." "No," said I, "my own fault for getting up late. Got a case for the CO. too. Is my watch right? I make it 17 minutes past." "19 I make it." "Ha! Wish I hadn't asked you," I laughed. "No porridge, Lewis. Bring the eggs and bacon in at once. This tea'll do. There's no milk though. What?" Edwards had asked something. He repeated his question, which was whether I wanted Jim, the company horse, this afternoon. I thought rapidly, and the scent of the lilac decided me. "Yes," I answered. "Sorry, but I do." "Oh, all right. I expect I can get old Musket to let me have one." Musket was the transport officer. "Right o," said I. "Go teach thy Lewis gunners how to drill little holes in the chalk bank." He clattered off over the cobbles of the garden path, and in a few minutes I followed suit, running until I rounded a corner and came into view of the orderly room, when I altered my gait to a dignified walk, and arrived just as the colonel appeared from the opposite direction. "Parade!" "Churn!" shouted Sergeant Major Shandon, and a moment later the 4 company commanders came to attention and saluted as the colonel passed in, sprinkling "good mornings" to right and left. I had one very uninteresting case of drunkenness. A had a couple of men who had overstayed their pass in England. C had a case held over from the day before for further evidence, and was now dismissed as not proven, while D had an unsatisfactory sergeant who was severely reprimanded. All these cases were quickly and unerringly disposed of, and we company commanders saluted again and clattered down the winding staircase out into the sunshine. I had to pass from one end of the village to the other. The orderly room was not far from our company mess, and was at a crossroads. Opposite, in one of the angles made by the junction of the 4 roads, was a deep and usually muddy horse pond. But even here the mud was getting hard under this spell of warm May weather, and the innumerable ruts and hoof marks were crystallizing into a permanent pattern. As I walked along the streets I passed sundry Tommies acting as road scavengers. Permanent road fatigue, they were called, although they were anything but permanent, being changed every day. Formerly they had seemed to be engaged in a Herculean, though unromantic, task of scraping great rolling puddings of mud to the side of the road, in the vain hope that the mud would find an automatic exit into the neighbouring gardens and ponds. For Morlancourt did not boast such modern things as gutters. To day there were large pats of mud lining the street, but these were now caked and hard, and even crumbling into dust, that whisked about among the sparrows. The permanent road fatigue was gathering waste paper and tins in large quantities, but otherwise was having a holiday. Women were working or gossiping at the doorsteps. The estaminet doors were flung wide open, and the floors were being scrubbed and sprinkled with sawdust. A little bare-legged girl in a black cotton dress was hugging a great wide loaf. An old man sat blinking in the sunshine. Cats were basking, dogs nosing about lazily. A party of about 30 bombers passed me, the sergeant giving "Eyes right," and waking me from meditations on the eternal calm of cats. Then I reached the headquarter guard, and the sentry saluted with a rattling clap upon his butt, and I did my best to emulate his smartness. So I passed along all the length of the shuttered houses of Morlancourt. A great day this, I thought, as I came to the small field where B Company was paraded. Not 250 men, as you will doubtless assume from the textbooks, but some 30 or 40 men only. One was lucky if one mustered 40. Where were the rest, you ask? Well, bombers bombing. Lewis gunners under Edwards, some on permanent mining fatigue, that is, carrying the sandbags from the mine shafts to the dumps. Transport, pioneers, stretcher bearers, men under bombing instruction, officers' servants, headquarter orderlies, men on leave, etc., etc. The company sergeant major will make out a parade slate for you if you want it, showing exactly where every man is. But here are 40 men. Let's drill them. Half were engaged in arm drill under my best drill sergeant. The other half were doing musketry in gas helmets, an unpleasant practice which nothing would induce me to do on a sunny May morning. They lay on their fronts, legs well apart, and were working the bolts of their rifles 15 times a minute. After a while they changed over and did arm drill, while the other half took over the gas helmets, the mouthpieces having first been dipped in a solution of carbolic brought by one of the stretcher bearers in a canteen. These gas helmets were marked D.P. drill purposes, and each company had so many with which to practise. When both parties were duly exercised, I gave a short lecture on the measures to be adopted against the use of Flammenwerfer, which is the "liquid fire" of the official communiqués. I had just been to a demonstration of this atrocity in the form of a captured German apparatus, and my chief object in lecturing the men about it was to make it quite clear that the flaming jets of burning gas cannot sink into a trench, but as a matter of fact only keep level so long as they are propelled by the driving power of the hose apparatus. As water from a hose goes straight, and then curves down to the ground, so gas, even though it be incandescent, goes straight and then rises. In the trench you are unscathed, as we proved in the demonstration, when they sprayed the flaming gas over a trench full of men. Indeed, the chief effect of this Flammenwerfer is one of frightfulness, as the Germans cannot come over until the flames have ceased. The men were rather inclined to gape at all this, but I found the words had sunk in when I asked what should be done if the enemy used this diabolical stuff against us. "Get down at the bottom of the trench, sir, and as soon as they stop it, give the blanks L." The rest of the morning we spent "on the range," which meant firing into a steep chalk bank at 100 yards. Targets and paste pot had been procured from the pioneer's shop, and after posting a couple of look out men on either side, we started range practice. The men are always keen about firing on the range, and it is really the most interesting and pleasant part of the infantryman's training. I watched these fellows, hugging their rifle butt into their shoulder, and feeling the smooth wood against their cheeks. They wriggled their bodies about to get a comfortable position. Sometimes they flinched as they fired and jerked the rifle. Sometimes they pressed the trigger as softly, and gradually, carefully, we tried to detect and eliminate the faults. Then we ended up with 15 rounds rapid in a minute. The mad minute, it used to be called at home. After which we fell the men in, and Paul marched them back to the company alarm post outside the company office, where B Company always fell in, while Owen, Nicholson, and I walked back together. 2. Afternoon. "I still maintain," said I an hour later, as we finished lunch, "that bully beef, some sort of sauce or pickle, and salad, followed by cheese, and ending with a cup of tea, is the proper lunch for an officer. I don't mind other officers having tinned fruit, though, if they like it," I added with a laugh. Owen and Syme were newly joined officers for whom the sight of tinned pears or apricots had not yet lost a certain glamour that disappeared after months and months. They were just finishing the pear course. Hence my last remark. "I bet if we allowed you to have bully every day," came from Edwards, our mess president, "you'd soon get sick of it." "Try," said I, knowing that he never would. I always used to eat of the hot things that would appear at lunch, to the detriment of a proper appreciation of dinner; but I always maintained the position laid down in the first sentence of this section. I lit a pipe and strolled out into the garden. This was undoubtedly an ideal billet, and a great improvement on the butcher's shop, where they used always to be killing pigs in the yard and letting the blood run all over the place. It was a long, one-storied house, set back about 50 yards from the road. This 50 yards was all garden, and at the end, completely shutting off the road, was a high brick wall. On each side of the garden were also high walls formed by the sides of stables and outhouses. The garden was thus completely walled round, and the seclusion and peace thus entrapped were a very priceless possession to us. The garden itself was full of life. There were box-bordered paths up both sides and down the centre, and on the inner side of the paths was an herbaceous border smelling very sweet of wallflowers and primulas of every variety. Although it was still May, there were already 1 or 2 pink cabbage roses out. Later, the house itself would be covered with them. Already the buds were showing yellow streaks as they tried to burst open their tight green sheaths. In the centre of the garden ran a cross path, with a summer house of bamboo canes completely covered with honeysuckle. That too was budding already. The rest of the garden was filled with rows of young green things, peas and cabbages, and I know not what, suitably protected against the ravages of sparrows and finches by the usual miniature telegraph system of sticks connected by cotton decorated with feathers and bits of rag. Every bit of digging, hoeing, weeding, and sowing were performed by Madame and her two black-dressed daughters in whose house we were now living, and who were themselves putting up in the adjoining farmhouse, which belonged to them. I said that they had done all the digging in the garden. I should make one reservation. All the potato patch had been dug by our servants, with the assistance of Gray, the cook. Nor did they do it in gratitude to Madame, as, doubtless, ideal Tommies would have done. A quarter of it was done by Lewis, for carelessness in losing my valise, nearly half of the joint effort of the whole crew for a thoroughly dirty turn-out on commanding officer's inspection, and the rest for other defalcations. We never told Madame the reasons for their welcome help, and I am quite sure they never did. "The worst of this war," said I to Edwards, puffing contentedly at a pipeful of Chairman, "is this. It's too comfortable. You could carry on like this for years and years and years." "Wasn't so jolly last time in," muttered the wise Edwards. "That's exactly the point," I answered. "Life in the trenches we all loathe, and no one makes any bones about it or pretends to like it, except for a few rare exciting minutes, which are very few and far between. But you come out into billets and recover, and so you can carry on. It's not concentrated enough." "It's more concentrated for the men than for us." "Well, yes, very often, but they haven't the strain of responsibility. Yes, you are right though, and it's less concentrated for the C.O., still less for the brigadier, and so on back to the commander in chief. And still further to men who have never seen a trench at all." "I daresay," said Edwards, "but, as the phrase goes, what are you going to do about it?" "Here's Jim. Old Musket's going to send me a nag at 5, so I'm going out after tea. Will you be in for tea?" "Don't know." As I tightened my puttees preparatory to mounting the great Jim, Edwards started his gramophone. So, leaving them to the strains of Tannhäuser, I bestrode my charger and steered him gracefully down the garden path, under the brick archway, and out into the street. Myself on a horse always amused me, especially when it was called an officer's charger. Jim was not fiery, yet he was not by any means sluggish, and he went fast at a gallop. He suited me very well indeed when I wanted to go for an afternoon's ride, for he was quite content to walk when I wanted to muse, and to gallop hard when I wanted exhilaration. I hate a horse that will always be trotting. I know it is best style to trot, but my rides were not for style, but for pleasure, exercise, and solitude. And Jim fell in admirably with my requirements. But, as I say, the idea that I was a company commander on his charger always amused me. I rode, as I generally did, in a southeasterly direction, climbing at a walk one of the many roads that led out of Morlancourt towards the Bois de Tailly. When I reached the high ground, I made Jim gallop along the grass border right up to the edge of the woods. There is nothing like the exhilaration of flying along. You cannot imagine how, with the great brown animal lengthening out under you for all he is worth. I pulled up and turned his head to the right, leaving the road, and skirting the edge of the wood. At last I was alone. In the clearings of the wood the ground was a sheet of blue hyacinths, whose sweet scent came along on the breeze. Their fragrance lifted my spirit, and I drank in deep breaths of the early summer air. I took off my cap to feel the sun full on my face. On the ground outside the wood were still a few late primroses interspersed with cowslips, stubborn and jolly; and as I rounded a bend in the wood edge I found myself looking across a tiny valley, the opposite face of which was a wooded slope, with all the trees banked up on it as gardeners bank geraniums in tiers to give a good massed effect. So, climbing the hillside, were all these shimmering patches of green, yellow green, pea green, yellow, massed together in delightful variety; and dotted about in the middle of them were solitary patches of white cherry blossom, like white foam breaking over a reef in the midst of a great green sea. And across this perfect softness from time to time the bold black and white of magpies, cut with that vivid contrast, which nature loves to baffle the poor artist. "Come on, old boy," I said as I reached the bottom of this little valley; and trotting up the other side, and through a ride in the wood, I came out on the edge of the valley of the Somme. I then skirted the south side of the wood until I reached a secluded corner with a view across the valley. Here I dismounted, fastened Jim to a tree, loosened his girths, and left him pulling greedily at the grass at his feet. Then I threw myself down on the grass to dream. My thoughts ran back to my conversation with Edwards. Perhaps it was best not to think too hard, but I could no more stifle my thoughts than can a man his appetite. Responsibility. Responsibility. And those with the greatest responsibility endure and see the least. No one has more to endure than the private soldier in the infantry, and no one has less responsibility or power of choice. I thought of our last 6 days in the trenches. When A Company were in the line, the first 3 days, we had been bombarded heavily at "Stand to" in the evening. In Maple Redoubt it had been bad enough. There was one sentry post a little way up Old Kent Road. By some mistake a bomber had been put on duty there, whereas it was a bayonet man's post, the bombers having a special rôle in case of the enemy attacking. I found this mistake had been made, but did not think it was worth altering. And that man was killed outright by a shell. In the front line, A Company had had several killed and wounded, and I had had to lend them half my bombers. As I had placed 2 men on one post, a canister had burst quite a long way off, but the men cowered down into the trench. I cursed them as hard as I could, and then I saw that in the post were the 2 former occupants lying dead, killed half an hour ago where they lay, and where I was placing my 2 men. I stopped my curses, and inwardly directed them against myself. And there I had to leave these fellows, looking after me and thinking, "He's going back in his dug out. Ah, no, they knew me better than to think like that." Yet I had to go back, leaving them there. I should never forget that awful weight of responsibility that suddenly seemed visualized before me. Could I not see their scared faces peering at me? Even now I seemed to smell the scent of pear drops with which the trench was permeated, the Germans having sent over a few lachrymatory shells along with the others that night. Ah, why was I living all this over again, just when I had come away to get free of all this a while, and dream? I had come out to enjoy the sunshine and the peace, just as Jim was enjoying the grass behind me. I listened. There was a slight jingle of the bit now and again, and a creaking of leather, and always that drawing sound, with an occasional purr, as the grass was torn up. I could not help looking round at last. "You pig," I said, but my tone did not altogether disapprove of complacent piggishness. In front of me lay the blue water of the Somme Canal, and the pools between it and the river. Long parallel rows of pale green poplars stretched along either bank of the canal, and at my feet, half hidden by the slope of the ground, lay the sleepy little village of Ettenham. There was a Sunday afternoon slumber over everything. Was it Sunday? I thought for a moment. No, it was Thursday, and tomorrow we went in again. I deliberately switched my thoughts away from the trenches, and they flew to the events of the morning. I could see my fellows lying, so keen, I might almost say so happy, blazing away on the range. One I remembered especially, Private Benjamin, a boy with a delicate, eager face, who came out with a last draft. He came from a village close up to Snowdon. He was shooting badly, and very concerned about it. I lay down beside him, and showed him how to squeeze the trigger, gradually, ever so gradually. Oh, these boys! Responsibility, responsibility. This is no good, I said to myself at last, and untied Jim, and rode again. I went down into the valley, and along the green track between an avenue of poplars south of the canal, until at last I came to Sailly-le-Rond, and so back and in to Morlancourt from the southwest. It was 6 o'clock by the time I stooped my head under the gateway into our garden, and for the last hour or so I had almost forgotten war at last. "Hullo," was the greeting I received from Owen. "There's no tea left." "I don't want any tea," I answered. "Has the post come?" There were 3 letters for me. As I slept at a house a little distance away, I took the letters along with me. "I'm going over to my room to clean up," I shouted to Owen, who was reading inside the mess room. "What time's old Jim coming in?" "7 o'clock." "All right," I answered. "I'll be over by 7." 3. Evening. As I walked up the garden path a few minutes before 7, I had to pass the kitchen door, where the servants slept, lived, and cooked our meals. I had a vision of Private Watson, the cook, busy at the oven. He was in his shirt sleeves, hair untidy, trousers very grimy, and altogether a very unmartial figure. There seemed to be a dispute in progress, to judge from the high pitch to which the voices had attained. On these occasions Lewis's piping voice reached an incredible falsetto, while his face flushed redder than ever. Watson, Owen's servant, had superseded Gray as officers' mess cook. The latter had, unfortunately, drunk 1 or 2 glasses of beer last time in billets, and, to give his own version, he "somehow felt very sleepy, and went down and lay under a bank," and could remember nothing more until about 10 o'clock, when he humbly reported his return to me. Meanwhile Watson had cooked the dinner, which was, of course, very late; and as he did it very well, and as Gray's explanation seemed somewhat vague, we decided to make Watson cook, let Gray try a little work in the company for a change, and get the sergeant major to send Owen another man for servant. Watson had signalled the entry to his new appointment by a quarrel with Madame (the Warwicks had managed to "bag" this ideal billet of ours temporarily, and we were in a much less comfortable one the last 2 occasions out of trenches). Eventually Madame had hurled the frying pan at him, amid a torrent of unintelligible French. Neither could understand a word the other was saying, of course. Gray had been wont, I believe, to "lie low and say nuffin'," like Brer Fox, when Madame, who was old and half crazed, came up and threw water on the fire in a fit of unknown anger. But Watson's blood boiled at such insults from a Frenchwoman, and hence had followed a sharp contention ending in the projection of the frying pan. Luckily we were unmolested here. Watson could manage the dinner anyway. I entered our mess room, which was large, light, and boasted a boarded floor. It was a splendid summer room, though it would have been very cold in winter. There I found a pile of literature awaiting me: operation orders for to morrow, giving the hour at which each company was to leave Morlancourt, and which company of the Manchesters it was to relieve, and when, and where, and the route to be taken. There were 2 typed documents, "For your information and retention, please," one relating to prevention of flying trouble in billets, the other giving a new code of signals and marked "Secret" on the top. And lastly there was "Comic Cuts." Leaving the rest, I hastily skimmed through the latter, which contained detailed information of operations carried out, and intelligence gathered on the Corps front during the last few days. At first these were intensely interesting, but after 7 months they began to pall, and I grew expert at skimming through them rapidly. Then Jim Potter came in, and "Comic Cuts" faded into insignificance. "Here, Owen," said I, and threw them over to him. Captain and Quartermaster Jim Potter was the father of the battalion. He had been in the battalion 16 years, and had come out with them in 1914. Twice the battalion had been decimated, new officers had come and disappeared, commanding officers had become brigadiers and new ones taken their place, but old Jim remained, calm, unaltered, steady as a rock, good-natured, and an utter pessimist. I first introduced him in Chapter 1, when I spent the night in his billet prior to my first advent into the trenches. I was a little perturbed then by his pessimism. Now I should have been very alarmed if he had suddenly burst into a fit of optimism. "Well, Jim," we said, "how are things going? When's the war going to end?" "Oh, not so very long now." We gaped at this unexpected reply. "Because," he added, "you know, Bill, it's the unexpected that always happens in this war. Hullo! You've got some pretty pictures, I see." We had been decorating the walls with the few unwarlike pictures that were still to be found in the illustrated papers. "Not a bad place, Blighty," he resumed, gazing at a picture entitled "Home Sweet Home." There had been a little dispute as to whether it should go up, owing to its sentimental nature. At last, "The Warwicks will like it," we had said, and up it had gone. The Warwicks had our billet when we were "in." "Tell us about your leave," we said, and Jim began a series of delightful sarcastic jerks about the way people in England seemed to be getting now a faint glimmering conception that somewhere there was a war on. The joint was not quite ready, Edwards explained to me, drawing me aside a minute. Would old Jim mind? The idea of old Jim minding being quite absurd, we decided on having a cooked joint a quarter of an hour hence, rather than a semi-raw one now; and we told Jim our decision. It seemed to suit him exactly, as he had had tea late. There never was such an unruffled fellow as he. Had we wanted to begin before the time appointed, he would have been ravenous. So he continued the description of his adventures on leave. Meanwhile I rescued "comic cuts" from the hands of Paul, and dispatched them, duly initialled, by the trusty Davies to C Company. Just as I had done so, the sergeant major appeared at the door. "You know the time we move off to morrow?" I said. Yes, he had known that long before I did, by means of the regimental sergeant major and the orderly sergeant. "Fall in at 8:15," I said. "Everything the same as usual. All the officers' servants, and Watson, are to fall in with the company. This straggling in independently, before or after the company, will stop once and for all." Lewis's face, as he laid the soup plates, turned half a degree redder than usual. "There's nothing more?" I said. "No, that's all, sir." The sergeant major drained off his whiskey with a dash of Perrier, and prepared to go. Now was the psychological moment, when one learnt any news there was to learn about the battalion. "No news, I suppose?" I asked. "The fellows are still talking about this rest, sir. No news about that, I suppose?" said the sergeant major. "Only that it's slightly overdue," I answered with a laugh. "What do you think, Jim? Any likelihood of this 3 weeks' rest coming off?" "Oh yes, I should think so," said the quartermaster. "Any time next year." "Good night, sir," said Sergeant Major Brown, with a grin. "Good night, Sergeant Major," came in a chorus as he disappeared into the garden. "Soup's ready, sir," said Lewis, and we sat down to dine. The extraordinary thing about having Jim Potter in to dinner was that an extra elaborate menu was always provided, and yet old Jim himself always ate less than anyone else. Still, he did his share nobly with the whiskey, so that made up for it, I suppose. To night Edward planned "sausages and mash" as an entrée, but, whether through superior knowledge or a mere misunderstanding, the sausages arrived seated carefully on the top of the round of beef, like marrons glacés, stuck on an iced cake. As the dish was placed, amid howls of execration, on the table, one of the unsteadier sausages staggered and fell with a splash into the gravy, much to everyone's delight. Edwards, wiping the gravy spots off his best tunic, seemed the only member of the party who did not greet with approbation this novel dish. After soup, sausages and beef, and rice pudding and tinned fruit, came Watson's special dish, cheese au gratin on toast. This was a glutinous concoction, and a little went a long way. Then followed café au lait made in the teapot, which was the signal for cigarettes to be lit up, and chairs to be moved a little to allow of a comfortable expansion of legs. Owen proposed sitting out in the summer house, but on going outside reported that it was a little too chilly, so we remained where we were. Edwards was talking of Amiens. He had been there for the day yesterday, and incidentally discovered that there was a cathedral there. "I know it," said I. "I used to go there every Saturday when I was at the Army School." "You had a good time at the Army School, didn't you?" asked Jim. "Tip-top time," said I. "It's a really good show. The Commandant was the most wonderful man we ever met. By the way, that concert Tuesday night was a really good show." Jim Potter and Edwards had got it up. It had been an al fresco affair, and the night had been ideally warm for it. Edwards had trained a Welsh choir with some success. Several outsiders had contributed, the star of the evening being Basil Hallam, the well-known music hall artist, whose dainty manner reminded one of the art of Vesta Tilley, and impeccable evening clothes had produced an unforgettably bizarre effect in the middle of such an audience and within sound of the guns. He was well known to most of the men as "the bloke that sits up in the sausage." For any fine day, coming out of trenches or going in, you could see high suspended the sausage, whose home and base was between Treux and Méricourt, and whose occupant and eye was Basil Hallam. And so the "sausage bloke" was received enthusiastically at our concert. As we talked about the concert, Owen began singing "Now Florrie was a flapper," which had been Basil Hallam's most popular song, and as he sang he rose from his chair and walked about the room. He was evidently enjoying himself, though his imitation of Basil Hallam was very bad indeed. As he sang he went on talking. "A good entry in Comic Cuts to night," I remarked. "A dog was heard barking in Fricourt at 11 p.m." Someone must have been hard up for intelligence to put that in. "A dog barking in Fricourt," said old Jim, warming up. "A dog barking in Fricourt. What's that, corps stuff? I never read the thing, good Lord, no. That's what it is to have a staff. A dog barking in Fricourt." "The corps officer didn't hear it," said I. "It was some battalion intelligence officer that was such a fool as to report it." "Fool?" said old Jim. "I'd like to meet the fellow. He's the first fellow I've ever met yet who has a just appreciation of the brain capacity of the staff. You or I might have thought of reporting a dog's mew, or roar, or bellow, but a dog's bark we should have thought of no interest whatever to the fellows up there, you know, who plan our destinies." And he gave an obsequious flick of his hand to an imaginary person too high up to see him at all. "He's a good fellow," he repeated, "that intelligence officer. Ought to get a D.S.O." Old Jim had 2 South African medals, a D.C.M. and a D.S.O. "The Staff," he went on, with the greatest contempt he could put into his voice. "I saw 3 of them in a car to day. I stood to attention, saluted. A young fellow waved his hand, you know, graciously accepted my salute, you know, and passed on leaning back in his limousine. The brains of the British Army, I thought. Pah!" We waited. Jim on the Staff was the greatest entertainment the battalion could offer. We tried to draw him out further, but he would not be drawn. We tried cunningly, by indirect methods, inquiring his views on whether there would be a push this year. "Push!" he said. "Of course there'll be a push. The Staff must have something to show for themselves. Shove 'em in, they say. Rather a bigger front than last time. Strategy? Oh, no. That's out of date, you know. 5 mile front, frontal attack. Get a few 100,000 mown down, and then discover the Boche has got a second line. The Staff. Pah!" And no more would he say. Then Clark came in, and the Manchester Stokes gun officer. Clark immediately joined Owen in a duet on "Florrie." Then we went through the whole gamut of popular songs, with appropriate actions and stamping of feet upon the floor. Meanwhile the table was cleared, only the whiskey and Perrier remained. Soon there were cries of "Napoleon! Napoleon!" and Owen, who bears a remarkable resemblance to that great personage, posed tragically again and again amid great applause. And then, in natural sequence, I, as "Bill, the man what won the Battle of Waterloo," attacked him with every species of trench mortar I could lay hands on, my head swathed in a remarkable turban of Daily Mail. At last I drove him into a corner behind a table, and bombarded him relentlessly with oranges until he capitulated. All the time Edwards had been in fear and trembling for the safety of his gramophone. At length peace was signed, and we grew quiet again beneath the soothing strains of the gramophone, until at last Jim Potter said he must really go. Every one reminding every one else that breakfast was at 7, we broke up the party, and Owen, Paul, Jim Potter and I departed together. But any one who knows the psychology of conviviality will understand that we had first to pay a visit to a neighbouring mess for one last whiskey and soda before turning in. As I opened the door of my billet, I heard a strafe getting up. There was a lively cannonade up in the line. For several minutes I listened, until it diminished a little, and began to die away. In tomorrow, I thought. My valise was laid out on the floor, and my trench kit all ready for packing first thing next morning. I lost no time in getting into bed. And yet I could not sleep. I could not help thinking of the jollity of the last few hours, the humour, the apparently spontaneous outburst of good spirits; and most of all I thought of old Jim, the mainspring somehow of it all. And again I saw the picture of the concert a few nights ago, the bright lights of the stage, the crowds of our fellows, all their bodies and spirits for the moment relaxed, good-natured, happy, as they stood laughing in the warm night air. And lastly I thought again of Private Benjamin, that refined eager face, that rather delicate body, and that warm hand as I placed mine over his, squeezing the trigger. He was no more than a child really, a simple-minded child of Wales. Somehow it was more terrible that these young boys should see this war than for the older men. Yet were we not all children wondering, wondering, wondering? Yes, we were like children faced by a wild beast. Sometimes I dislike you almost, I thought, your dullness, your coarseness, your lack of romance, your unattractiveness. Yet that is only physical. You I love really. Oh, the dear, dear world. And in the darkness I buried my face in the pillow and sobbed. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of Nothing of Importance, by Bernard Adams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A certain man drew a bow at a venture. It was 10 o'clock as I came in from the wiring party in front of Rue Albert, and at that moment our guns began. We were in Maple Redoubt. The moon had just set, and it was a still summer night in early June. "Come and have a look," I called to Owen, who had just entered the dug out. I could see him standing with his back to the candlelight, reading a letter or something. He came out, and together we looked across the valley at the shoulder of down that was silhouetted by the continuous light of gun flickers. Our guns had commenced a 2 hours' bombardment. "No answer from the Boche yet," I said. "They're firing on C2, down by the cemetery." "Yes, I hardly noticed it. Our guns make such a row. By Jove, it's magnificent." We gazed fascinated for a long time, and then went into the dug out where Edwards and Paul were snoring rhythmically. I read for half an hour, but the dug out was stuffy, and the smell of sandbags and the flickering of the candle annoyed me for some reason or other. Somehow "Derelicts" by W. J. Locke failed to grip my attention. Owing to our bombardment there were no working parties, in case the Germans should take it into their head to retaliate vigorously; but at present there was no sign of that. I went outside again, and walked along Park Lane until I came to the Lewis gun position just this side of the corner of Watling Street. The sentry was standing up, gazing alert and interested at the continuous flicker of our shells bursting along the enemy's trenches. Lance Corporal Allen looked out of the dug out, and, seeing me, came out and stood by us. And together we watched, all three of us, in silence. Overhead was the continual screeching, whistling of the shells as they passed over, without pause or cessation. Behind was a chain of gun flickers the other side of the ridge. And in front was another chain of flashes and a succession of bump, bump, bumps as the shells burst relentlessly in the German trenches. And where we stood, under the noisy arch, was a steady calm. "This is all right, sir," said Lance Corporal Allen. He was the N.C.O. in charge of this Lewis gun team. "Yes," said I. "The artillery are not on short rations to night." For always, through the last 4 months, the artillery had been more or less confined to so many shells a day. The officers used to tell us they had any amount of ammunition, yet no sooner were they given a free hand to retaliate as much as they wanted, than an order came cancelling this privilege. To night, at any rate, there was no curtailment. "I believe this is the beginning of a new order of things," I said, half musing to myself. "That is, I believe the Boche is going to get lots and lots of this now." "About time, sir," said the sentry. "Is there a push coming off?" said Lance Corporal Allen. "I don't know," I replied, "but I expect we shall be doing something soon. It's quite certain we're going to get our 3 weeks' rest after this turn in. The Brigadier Major told me so." Corporal Allen smiled, and as he did so, the flashes lit up his face. He was quite a boy, only 18, I believe, but an excellent N.C.O. He had a very beautiful though sensuous face that used to remind me sometimes of the satyr of Praxitele. His only fault was an inclination to sulkiness at times, which was perhaps due to a little streak of vanity. It was no wonder the maidens of Morlancourt made eyes at him, and a little girl who lived next door to the Lewis guns' billet was said to have lost her heart long ago. To night I felt a pang as I saw him smile. "We'll see," I said. "Anyway, it's going to be a good show giving the Boche these sort of pleasant dreams. Better than those 1-minute stunts." I was referring to a 1-minute bombardment of Fricourt Wood that had taken place last time we were in the line. It was a good spectacle to see the wood alive with flames, hear our Vickers guns rattling hard behind us from the supports, and see the Germans firing excited green and red rockets into the air. But the retaliation had been unpleasant, and the whole business seemed not worth while. This continuous pounding was quite different. I went back and visited the other gun position, and spent a few minutes there also. At last I turned in reluctantly. I went out again at 11:30, and still the shells were screaming over. It seemed the token of an irresistible power, and there was no reply at all now from the German lines. The short summer nights made life easier in some respects. We "stood to" earlier, and it was quite light by 3. As I turned in again, I paused for a moment to take in the scene. Davies had retired to a small dug out that looked exactly like a dog kennel, and was not much larger. As Davies himself frequently reminded me of a very intelligent sheep dog, the dog kennel seemed most suitable. I heard him turning about inside, as I stood at the door of our own dug out. The scene was one of the most perfect peace. The sun was not up, but by now the light was firm and strong. Night had melted away. I went back and walked a little while along Park Lane until I came to a gap in the newly erected sandbag parados. I went through the gap and into a little graveyard that had not been used now for several months. And there I stood in the open, completely hidden from the enemy, on the reverse slope of the hill. Below me were the dug outs of 71 North, and away to the left those of the Citadel. Already I could see smoke curling up from the cookers. There was a faint mist still hanging about over the road there, that the strong light would soon dispel. On the hillside opposite lay the familiar tracery of Redoubt A, and the white zigzag mark of Maidstone Avenue climbing up well to the left of it, until it disappeared over the ridge. Close to my feet the meadow was full of buttercups and blue veronica, with occasional daisies starring the grass. And below, above, everywhere, it seemed, was the tremulous song of countless larks, rising, growing, swelling, till the air seemed full to breaking point. And there was not a sound of war. Who could desecrate such a perfect June morning? I felt a mad impulse to run up and across into No Man's Land and cry out that such a day was made for lovers, that we were all enmeshed in a mad nightmare, that needed but a bold man's laugh to free us from its clutches. Surely this most exquisite morning could not be the birth of another day of pain. Yet I felt how vain and hopeless was the longing, as I turned at last and saw the first slant rays of sunlight touch the white sandbags into life. "What time's this working party?" asked Paul at 4 o'clock that afternoon. "I told the sergeant major to get the men out as soon as they'd finished tea," I replied. "About 4:45 they ought to be ready. He will let you know all right." "Hullo," said Paul. "What are you hulloing about?" I asked. Paul did not answer. Faintly I heard a whee-oo, 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 that grew louder and louder and ended in a swishing roar like a big wave breaking against an esplanade, and then whump, 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 whump. 4.42s exploded beyond the parados of Park Lane. "Well over," said Edwards. "I expected this," I answered. "They've been too damned quiet all day, especially after the pounding we gave them last night." "There they are again," I added. This time I had heard the 4 distant thuds, and we all waited. Whump, whump, crump. There was a colossal din. The 2 candles went out, and there was a shaking and jarring in the blackness. Then followed the sound of falling stuff, and I felt a few patters of earth all over me. Gradually it got lighter, and through the smoke-filled doorway the square of daylight reappeared. "Je ne l'aime pas," said I, as we all waited, without speaking. Then Edwards struck a match and lit the candles. All the table, floor and beds were sprinkled with dust and earth. Then Davies burst in. "Are you all right?" we asked. "Yes, sir. And you?" "Oh, we're all right, Davies," said I. "But there's a job for Lewis cleaning this butter up." At length we went outside, stepping over a heap of loose yielding earth, mixed up with lumps of chalk and bits of frayed sandbags. Outside, the trench was blocked with débris of a similar kind. Already 2 men had crossed it, and several men were about to do so. It was old already. There was still a smell of gunpowder in the air and a lot of chalk dust that irritated your nose. "I think I'll tell the sergeant major not to get the working party out just yet," I said to Paul. "They often start like that and then put lots more over about a quarter of an hour later." And I sped along Park Lane quickly. As I returned I heard footsteps behind me. I looked round, but the men were hidden by a traverse. And then came tragedy, sudden and terrible. I have seen many bad sights, every man killed is a tragedy, but one avoids and hides away the hideousness as soon as possible. But never, save once perhaps, have I seen the thing so vile as now. "Look out!" I heard a voice from behind. And as I heard the shells screaming down, I tumbled into the nearest dug out. The shell burst with a huge crump, but not so close as the one that had darkened our dug out 10 minutes before. Then again another 4 shells burst together, but some 40 or 50 yards away. I waited 1, 2 minutes, and then I heard men running in the trench. As I sprang up the dug out steps I saw 2 stretcher bearers standing looking round the traverse. And then there was the faint whistling overhead, and they pushed me back as they almost fell down the dug out steps. "Is there a man hurt?" I asked. "We can't leave him." "He's dead," said one. And as he spoke there were 3 more explosions a little to the left. "Are you sure?" "Aye," said the stretcher bearer, and closed his eyes tight. "He's past our help," said the other man. At last, after a minute's calm, we stepped out into the sunshine. I went round the traverse, following the 2 stretcher bearers. And looking between them, as they stood gazing, this is what I saw. In the trench, half buried in rags of sandbag and loose chalk, lay what had been a man. His head was nearest to me, and at that I gazed fascinated, for the shell had cut it clean in half, and the face lay like a mask, its features unmarred at all, a full foot away from the rest of the head. The flesh was grey, that was all. The open eyes, the nose, the mouth were not even twisted awry. It was like the fragment of a sculpture. All the rest of the body was a mangled mass of flesh and khaki. "Who is it?" whispered a stretcher bearer, bending his head down to look sideways at that mask. "Find his identity disc," said the other. "It is Lance Corporal Allen," said I. Then up came the regimental sergeant major, and Owen followed him. They too gazed in horror for a moment. The sergeant major was the first to recover. "Hi, you fellows," he called to two men. "Get a waterproof sheet." "Come away, old man," said I to Owen. In silence we walked back to the dug out. But my brain was whirling. A certain man drew a bow at a venture. I thought again. That was how it was possible. No man could keep on killing if he could see the men he killed. But who had fired that howitzer shell? A German gunner somewhere right away in Mametz Wood probably. He would never see his handiwork, never know what he had done to day. He would never see. That was the point. Had he known, he would have rejoiced that there was one Englishman less in the world. It was not his fault. We were just the same. What of last night's bombardment? The memory of Lance Corporal Allen up by his gun position gave me a quick sharp pang. Had we not watched with glittering eyes the magnificent shooting of our own gunners? This afternoon's strafe was but a puny retaliation. Slowly it came back to me, the half-formed picture that had arisen in my mind the night of Davidson's death. A certain man drew a bow at a venture. Expressed it perfectly. It was splendid twanging the bow, feeling the fingers grip the polished wood, watching the bowstring stretch and strain, and then letting the arrow fly. That was the fascinating, the deadly fascinating side of war. That was what made it possible to carry on. I remember my joy in calling up the artillery in revenge for Thompson's death. And then again, whenever we put a mine up, how exhilarating was the spectacle! Throwing a bomb, firing a Lewis gun, all these things were pleasant. It was like the joy of throwing stones over a barn and hearing them splash into a pond, like driving a cricket ball out of the field. But the arrows fell somewhere. That was the other side of war. The dying king leant on his chariot, propped up until the sun went down. The man who had fired the bolt never knew he had killed a king. That was the other side of war. That was the side that counted. What I had just seen was war. I leaned my face on my arm against the parados. Oh, this unutterable tragedy! Had there ever been such a thing before? Why was this thing so terrible? Why did I have this feeling of battering against some relentless power? Death. There were worse things than death. There were sights, such as I had just come from, as terrible in everyday life, in any factory explosion or railway accident. There was nothing new in death. Vaguely my mind felt out for something to express this thing, so far more terrible than mere death. And then I saw it. Vividly I saw the secret of war. What made war so cruel was the force that compelled you to go on. After a factory explosion you cleared up things and then took every precaution to prevent its recurrence. But in war you did the opposite. You used all your energies to make more explosions. You killed and went on killing. You saw men die around you, and you deliberately went on with the thing that would cause more of your friends to die. You were placed in an arena and made to fight the beasts. And if you killed one beast, there were more waiting, and more, and more. And above the arena, out of it, secure, looking down, the glittering eyes of the men who had placed you there, cruel, relentless eyes, that went on glittering while the mouths expressed admiration for your impossible struggles, and pity for your fate. "Oh God, I shall go mad," I thought, in the agony of my mind. I saw into that strange empty chamber which is called madness. I knew what it would be like to go mad. And even as I saw, came the thought again of those glittering eyes, and the ruthless answer to my soul's cry, "The war is utterly indifferent whether you go mad or not." Owen was standing waiting for me. I grew calm again, and turned and put my hand on his shoulder. Together we reached the door of the dug out. "Oh, Bill," he said, "have you ever seen anything more awful?" "Only once. No, not more awful. More beastly. Nothing could be more awful." We told the others. "Not Alan," said Edwards. He was Lewis gun officer, and Alan was his best man. "Not Alan," he repeated. "Oh, how will they tell his little girl in Morlancourt? What will she say when she learns she will never see him again?" "Thank God she never saw him as we saw him just now," I said. "And thank God his mother never saw him." "If women were in this war, there would be no war," said Edwards. "I wonder," said I. Chapter 16